Legendary broadcast journalist Bill Moyers has said, "We've got to get alternative content out there to people or this country's going to die of too many lies." Moyers was asked what the corporate media means for our democracy. "It means that virtually everything the average person sees or hears outside of her own personal communications is determined by the interests of private, unaccountable executives and investors whose primary goal is increasing profits and raising the share prices. More insidiously, this small group of elites determines what ordinary people do not see or hear. In-depth coverage of anything, let alone the problems real people face day to day, is as scarce as sex, violence, and voyeurism are pervasive. I've tried to tell my college students in popular music class that it's problematic that so few corporations determine almost everything they listen to in their earbuds. Corporations are piping a steady diet of whatever they want into their heads. And what Bill Moyers is describing is the same problem. So in a nutshell, that's the whole purpose of this show. On yesterday's show, I had quite a bit of my own content, and you may or may not have been able to tell that I had prepared some of it ahead of time. More often in my commentary, I'm off the cuff, except I'm not wearing sleeves. But whether I'm curating other people's content or delivering my own content, the point is truth to power. The point is giving you information you wouldn't ordinarily receive or have access to. So to escape what Bill Moyers was describing, that virtually everything the average person sees or hears outside of her own personal communications is determined by the interests of private, unaccountable executives and investors, then it's my job to bring you an alternative to that and to give you information that they may not want you to see or hear. Case in point, here's a tweet by Glenn Greenwald that I'm pretty sure the established powers don't want you to see. "There are no charges pending against Julian Assange in the UK. A UK judge denied the US's request to extradite him, the only place where charges are pending. Despite this, the judge just ruled he must remain imprisoned in a COVID-ridden high-security prison while the US appeals." This shows how authoritarian the British judiciary is. The only thing the US cares about is keeping Assange in a cage, silenced, and disappeared. This gives them the best of all worlds. He stays in prison with no need to prove he's guilty of anything. That's despotic. In the comments from a show a couple of days ago, Cynthia Johnstone says, "Max Blumenthal said last night on the Gray Zone livestream he knew for a fact that AOC launched the attacks against Jimmy Dore. And if you haven't been following the story, Jimmy Dore started a hullabaloo with his Force the Vote hashtag campaign. He wanted AOC to hold Nancy Pelosi's feet to the fire and demand a floor vote on Medicare for All in exchange for voting for her as Speaker." Cynthia goes on, "If there is one reporter I trust in media, it's Max Blumenthal. So that's what she did. That's where AOC's efforts went. Not strategizing and gaining concessions. Her efforts went to smearing the guy who was holding her accountable to what she ran on. And some people think she doesn't deserve to be sworn at. At least Jimmy Dore stands behind what he said and faces the consequences of his words. AOC sends her flying monkeys to do her dirty work for her so she can sit pure as the driven snow, clutching her pearls in her unassailable ivory tower. Turns my stomach." I replied that Jimmy seems aware that AOC turned her neolib minions loose on him. "It was obvious," says Cynthia, "that the Democratic Party came gunning for Dore, but for Blumenthal to say AOC herself coordinated it has to prove once and for all she is not just a well-intentioned progressive who lost her way in the big, bad Democratic Party. No more benefit of the doubt. She is officially a dishonest actor." I, for one, assumed it was Sneera Tandon that mustered the trolls. Finding out it was AOC herself, all the while clutching her pearls at the window of her ivory tower, just made her hypocrisy extra specially nauseating. Mainstream media even protect AOC. They don't want you to know this about her. And the narrative managers and consent manufacturers absolutely don't want you to ever read Caitlin Johnstone. Mainstream media already using Capitol Hill riot to call for more internet censorship. Yesterday, Victor Tiffany asked me what I thought about the Capitol Hill riot, and I responded that we need to do more riots. We just need to make sure that we're rioting about the right things, but we need to do more riots. And the rioters on the so-called right and on the so-called left need to get together, because we are all in this together. The government is screwing all of us, and we need to coordinate our efforts as we overthrow it. Caitlin has this to say. The United States received a very small taste of its own medicine today as rioting Trump fanatics temporarily forced their way into the nation's Capitol building, and now the whole nation is freaking out. I showed you a little bit of Joe Biden freaking out. It was either yesterday or the day before. I'm being generous when I say that America was given a very small taste of its own medicine. Unlike the horrific coups and violent uprisings the US routinely orchestrates in non-compliant nations around the world, this one stood exactly zero chance of seizing control of the government, and only one person was killed. Turns out 4 or 5 people died, one of them was a policeman, but that's small potatoes compared to drone strikes. I am also being generous when I say the rioters forced their way in. DC chose not to increase its police presence in preparation for the protests, despite knowing that they were planned, and there's footage of what appears to be cops actively letting them through a police barricade. There was some fighting between police and protesters, but contrasted with the unceasing barrage of police brutality footage which emerged from Black Lives Matter demonstrations a few months prior, it's fair to say the police response today was relatively gentle. On Jimmy Dore's show, they showed rioters taking selfies with the police. The police opened the fucking gates.
Police are squabbling with protesters. Oh, there we go. And they just breached the Capitol again.
A point that some people miss is that police might eventually be sympathetic to other people's protests as well. A lot of police personnel have to realize that it's us against the government. There were lots of black policemen and women who were sympathetic to the BLM protests. If we have a righteous cause, I don't see the police and the military getting in our way too much going forward. Which of these public servants took an oath to turn on their own people when the times get hard? But if you're against the protests, I don't mind if you get called names by people like Kate. Predictably, this entirely American disruption has blue check-marked commentariat shrieking about Vladimir Putin on social media. If you're shrieking about Vladimir Putin on social media, you really need to pull your head out of your ass. Ben Rhodes, Robert Reich, Greg Miller, Joyce Aileen, you need to pull your heads out of your asses. What good is it if you say some things that sound left and then blame Putin for everything? I think it's interesting to equate Putin winning with the United States people rising up. Whether or not these protesters are rising up for a good cause, they still need to rise up. We all need to rise up together. That's why journalists such as Caitlin Johnstone here are indispensable. The blue-checked commentariat are not our friends. As Caitlin says, they're predictably calling for the censorship of social media. The New York Times has published 2 new articles titled "The Storming of Capitol Hill Was Organized on Social Media" and "Violence on Capitol Hill is a Day of Reckoning for Social Media," both arguing for more heavy-handed restrictions on speech from Silicon Valley tech giants. In the former article, New York Times Shira Frankel writes, "The violence Wednesday was the result of online movements operating in closed social media networks where people believed the claims of voter fraud and of the election being stolen from Mr. Trump." Citing the expert analysis of think tank spinmeister Rene DiResta of Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian asset fame. As usual, no mention is made of DiResta's involvement in the New Knowledge scandal in which a Russian interference false flag was staged for an Alabama Senate race. I didn't know about that either. Senate report on Russian interference was written by disinformation warriors behind Alabama false flag operation. Hailed by Congress and the media as defenders of democracy, high-tech Russiagate hustlers Jonathan Morgan and Ryan Fox have been exposed for waging an elaborate false flag operation to swing the 2017 Alabama Senate race. Skipping ahead, but the authors of one of the reports soon suffered a major blow to their credibility when it was revealed that they had engaged in what they called a Russian-style online disinformation operation aimed to swing a hotly contested special Senate election. The embarrassing revelation has already resulted in one of the authors having his Facebook page suspended. I wonder how that feels. But anyway, that was the New Knowledge scandal. These people are acting because they are convinced an election was stolen, DiResta said. This is a demonstration of the very real-world impact of echo chambers. Lee Camp pointed out a couple of days ago that a couple 100,000 people were purged from the voter rolls in Georgia recently. There's all kinds of election fraud happening, and Lee made the point that neither side wants to talk about it. From my tinfoil hat perspective, it's not difficult to believe that there was election fraud in the recent general election. I think Trump probably would have lost anyway, but the fact that mainstream media don't seem to care about election fraud is troublesome. Ask Greg Palast about it. He'll tell you unequivocally there was election fraud in the general election as well as in the primaries. But no, our elections are sacrosanct. Nothing bad is happening. Every time I talk about elections on YouTube, YouTube puts a disclaimer underneath each of the videos. Here, let's scroll down through some of my videos. Let me find one where I talk about election fraud. Here it is. The ruling class wins again. Underneath this particular video, it says, U.S. elections. The Electoral College has confirmed Joe Biden as president-elect. States certify results after ensuring ballots are properly counted and correcting irregularities and errors. Learn more. So if there are alternative points of view, and in this case they're well documented, YouTube will come in and say, nope, 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 nothing to see here, folks. DiResta goes on, this has been a striking repudiation of the idea that there is an online and an offline world and that what is said online is in some way kept online, DiResta adds. This narrative, which seeds the idea that unregulated communication on the internet will lead to violent uprisings, is funny coming from Frankel, who as a Twitter follower recently observed, wrote a piece in 2018 condemning the Iranian government for restricting protesters' social media access during the demonstrations at that time. Social media and messaging apps have become crucial to anti-government demonstrators around the world as a means of both organizing and delivering messages to other citizens, Frankel wrote. Not surprisingly, restricting access to such technology has become as important to government crackdowns as the physical presence of the police. In the other article, co-authored by Frankel, Mike Isaac, and Kate Conger, the message is driven home even less subtly. As pro-Trump protesters stormed the Capitol building on Wednesday and halted the certification of Electoral College votes, the role of social media companies such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in spreading misinformation and being a megaphone for Mr. Trump came under renewed criticism, reads the article, adding, so when violence broke out in Washington on Wednesday, it was, in the minds of longtime critics, the day the chickens came home to roost for the social media companies. Make no mistake, dear viewers and listeners, the crackdown that they're asking for would absolutely be a crackdown on people like me. A crackdown on crackpots. The article reports on the U.S. president's temporary suspension of social media privileges for allegedly inciting violence with his posts, then discusses the various kinds of disinformation and violent ideation being circulated in Trump discussion forums. Personally, I think it's crazy that the President of the United States is not allowed by media giants to communicate directly with the people of the United States. How is it Silicon Valley's job to decide what the President is allowed and isn't allowed to say to the people of the United States? If the people don't like what he's saying, then the people ought to be able to decide what to do about it. We don't need Silicon Valley babysitters, and we don't need mainstream media babysitters either. If anything in the world were going to incite me to riot, it would be censorship. Back to the story. Those alternative social media sites were rife with Trump supporters organizing and communicating on Wednesday, New York Times tells us. On Parler, one trending hashtag was Storm the Capitol. Many Trump supporters on the sites also appeared to believe a false rumor that Antifa, a left-wing movement, was responsible for committing violence at the protests. I think we all should be responsible for committing violence at the protests. Joe Biden won't like it, but oh well. We know the social media companies have been lackadaisical at best at stopping extremism from growing on their platforms, Jonathan Greenblatt, director of the Anti-Defamation League, told New York Times. Freedom of expression is not the freedom to incite violence. That is not protected speech. He probably would have said the same thing to the writers of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, it's not protected speech from the perspective of the King of England. We likely will see many more such articles in the coming days arguing for increased regulation of internet communication to prevent future incidents like today. In and of itself, this won't sound terribly concerning to the average citizen. Nothing wrong with taking steps to prevent people from plotting violence and terrorism on social media, right? But how do you predict what protests are going to be violent? How do you decide which protests and what political dissent need to be censored and which ones should be permitted to communicate freely? Do you just leave it up to Silicon Valley oligarchs to make the call, or do you have them consult with the government like they've been doing? Are either of these institutions you'd trust to regulate what protests are worthy of being permitted to organize online? Because the actual power structures in the United States seem to be interested in simply censoring the internet to eliminate political dissent altogether. In 2017, top officials from Facebook, Twitter, and Google were brought before the Senate Judiciary Committee and admonished to come up with policies that will prevent the fomenting of discord in the United States. That should make all of us shudder. World Socialist website reported the following in 2017. Democratic Senator Mazi Hirono of Hawaii demanded, for her part, that the companies adopt a mission statement expressing their commitment to prevent the fomenting of discord. The most substantial portion of the testimony took place in the second part of the hearing, during which most of the senators had left, and two representatives of the U.S. intelligence agencies testified before a room of mostly empty chairs. Clint Watts, a former U.S. Army officer, former FBI agent, and member of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, made the following apocalyptic proclamation. Civil wars don't start with gunshots, they start with words. America's war with itself has already begun. We all must act now on the social media battlefield to quell information rebellions that can quickly lead to violent confrontations and easily transform us into the divided states of America. He added, stopping the false information artillery barrage landing on social media users comes only when those outlets distributing bogus stories are silenced. Silence the guns and the barrage will end. That sounds an awful lot like government officials and operatives telling social media corporations that it's their job to censor communication which could facilitate any kind of unrest, no matter how justified. Do you trust these monopolistic megacorporations to decide whether or not people's dissident speech is acceptable? I don't. As Julian Assange is condemned to remain falsely imprisoned and the mass media ramp up their case for more imperial narrative control, we are now in a battle for the sovereignty of our very minds.